3:18 p.m., a blistering tactical range at a massive military base in Arizona. A squad of elite infantry soldiers is deep in a high-stakes casualty evacuation drill, and the pressure is rising. Dust swirls under the brutal desert sun, and the tension is thick as the simulated casualties begin to appear. The squad must hold their position against an aggressive, simulated enemy until the extraction helicopter arrives. One soldier looks at the team's female medic and smirks. "A nurse can't hold the line," he jokes, assuming she'll just stay in the back. Petty Officer Laura Bennett says absolutely nothing. She just tightens her trauma bag. 5 minutes later, the line starts to break. Laura Bennett was a Navy hospital corpsman, though the Army grunts she was attached to for this specific high-intensity rotation simply called her Doc, or, when they were feeling particularly dismissive, the nurse, in the high-testosterone, adrenaline-fueled environment of a tactical infantry unit. Support personnel are often viewed through a lens of secondary importance. To the soldiers carrying the heavy M4 carbines, the belt-fed machine guns, and the breaching charges, the medic was someone who existed in the periphery. They saw her as someone who waited safely in the rear, someone who only became relevant after the real work. The fighting was already finished. The heat in Arizona was more than just a temperature. It was a physical, suffocating weight. It was 107 degrees of dry, punishing radiation that made the sweat dry on your skin before it could even cool you down, leaving nothing but a gritty crust of salt. Every breath felt like inhaling fine glass, and the sun reflected off the rifle scopes with a blinding, jagged glare. The horizon shimmered with a deceptive mirage, making the plywood village in the distance look like it was melting into the sand. Laura stood at the far edge of the formation during the pre-mission brief, her 60-pound Stomp medical pack strapped to her back like a massive turtle shell. She looked strikingly small compared to the bearded giants around her, her frame almost dwarfed by the heavy ceramic plates of her Kevlar vest and the trauma supplies bulging from every tactical pouch on her belt. She was a ghost in their machine, a variable they hadn't bothered to calculate. They didn't see the calloused hands that had worked through 20-hour shifts on a pitching hospital ship, or the eyes that had seen the transition from life to death more times than they had pulled a trigger. To them, she was a healer in a world of shooters, and they didn't think healers knew how to survive the dirt. They saw the red cross on her arm and assumed it was a target to be protected, rather than a symbol of the person who would ultimately protect them. "Hey, Doc," a private first class named Miller said, wiping a mixture of red grit and sweat from his forehead. He leaned on his rifle with a casual, almost bored arrogance. "You ready for the real work today? Just make sure you stay behind me when the simulation goes live. We wouldn't want you getting your pristine bandages all dusty in the first 5 minutes. A nurse can't really hold the line when things get hot. You just focus on the Band-Aids and the ibuprofen, and we'll handle the heavy lifting." The other soldiers offered a chorus of low chuckles. It wasn't necessarily meant to be cruel. It was just the deeply ingrained culture of the tip of the spear. They measured human worth in firepower, speed, and raw muscle, and they fundamentally didn't believe a medic, especially a female one, belonged in the chaotic heart of a tactical struggle. They saw her as a liability that needed protecting, not a force multiplier. Laura didn't respond to the jab with words. She had heard variations of this theme for years, in the sterile corridors of naval hospitals, on the rocking decks of amphibious ships, and in the mud of Marine Corps training camps. She didn't feel the need to defend her resume. Instead, she performed a final, rhythmic check of her gear. She verified the tension on her cat tourniquets. She ensured her vented chest seals were indexed and ready for a one-handed draw, and she adjusted the chin strap of her helmet. She knew something Miller didn't, a lesson carved into her brain by years of high-pressure trauma simulations. The line isn't held by bullets alone. It's held by the person who can maintain clarity when everyone else is drowning in their own adrenaline. The exercise was designed by the instructors to be a total nightmare. It was a mass casualty simulation, the kind that breaks even veteran squads. The unit had to navigate through a narrow, urban concrete corridor, clear a series of dark, booby-trapped rooms, and then defend a central exposed courtyard where 4 wounded soldiers, actors fitted with high-fidelity, bleeding prosthetics, were located. The extraction helicopter was 10 minutes out, but in a high-stress drill where every second is packed with noise and simulated danger, 10 minutes can feel like a lifetime. As the green signal flares hissed into the sky, the simulation exploded into pure chaos. The enemy, an opposing force of hardened instructors, utilized thick canisters of orange smoke, loudspeakers blasting the deafening sounds of heavy gunfire, and sudden aggressive movements that forced the squad into a frantic defensive posture. Almost immediately, the squad's carefully planned structure began to fray under the sensory overload. The infantrymen were tactically fixated on the shooters on the rooftops, and their communication began to break down. 2 soldiers were hit in the first 30 seconds, their digital vests screaming a high-pitched tone to indicate they were incapacitated. Miller and the other riflemen surged forward, their barrels smoking as they fired blank rounds into the windows. But they were focused entirely on the threat. In their tunnel vision, they forgot about the primary mission, which was to keep the casualties alive and prepare them for the flight. The wounded actors began to scream in high-pitched, realistic agony, their blood pumping from simulated femoral arteries, adding a layer of psychological stress that caught the younger soldiers completely off guard. "We're losing the rhythm. We're losing the perimeter," the squad leader shouted, his voice cracking over the simulated explosions. "Miller, get the casualties to the wall. I can't see the shooters through this smoke. Doc, stay down." In the middle of the whirling dust, the choking smoke, and the utter confusion, Laura Bennett finally moved. She didn't move away from the noise. She sprinted directly into the center of the kill zone. While the infantrymen were struggling to balance their weapons and their rising fear, Laura was already in her element. She saw the injustice of their earlier dismissal in every frantic, uncoordinated move they made. But she didn't have a single second to be angry. She had heartbeats to protect. If you think medics are often underestimated, type. That's so unfair. The courtyard was now a chaotic hellscape of orange smoke, screaming actors, and the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of simulated mortar fire. The sound was a distraction for the boys, but for Laura, it was just background noise to the frantic heartbeat under her hand. Miller was trying to drag one of the 200-pound casualties toward a concrete pillar, but the panic was visible in his jerky movements. He was doing it wrong, pulling on the man's tactical vest in a way that would have permanently aggravated a spinal injury in a real-world scenario. He was frantic, constantly looking over his shoulder at the simulated muzzle flashes from the rooftops instead of focusing on the bleeding man in his hands. "Miller, drop him and get back on the northwest corner." Laura's voice cut through the cacophony like a scalpel. It wasn't a request, and it wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that carried the absolute, undeniable weight of professional authority. Miller blinked, momentarily stunned to hear the nurse shouting orders at him in the middle of a fight. "But he's bleeding out, Doc. I have to. I said get back on your sector. Your rifle is the only thing keeping us from being flanked. I have the casualty. Go." Laura slid into the dirt beside the wounded soldier, her movements a blur of mechanical, practiced efficiency. She didn't look at the smoke. She didn't look at the enemy on the roof. Her entire world had shrunk down to the size of the man's chest and the pulsing blood on his leg. She began the march algorithm, the sacred heartbeat of tactical combat casualty care. Massive hemorrhage. She didn't fumble. She didn't hesitate. She reached for her shears, the metal cold against her fingers, and cut through the uniform in one clean stroke. She found the wound on the actor's upper thigh. In less than 4 seconds, she had a cat tourniquet out, threaded and twisted with a bone-crushing force that made the actor grunt in genuine surprise. High and tight. The bleeding stopped. Airway. She tilted the head, checked for obstructions, and ensured the man could breathe through the dust. Respiration. She noticed the actor's prosthetic chest was rising unevenly, a simulated sucking chest wound. She ripped open a high-fin vented chest seal and slapped it onto the wound, with a wet thwack that could be heard even over the speakers. The contrast was stark. The bright synthetic blood staining the pale Arizona sand was a visual marker of the stakes they were playing for. The metallic smell of the simulated fluid mixed with the ozone of the blanks, creating a sensory overload that made many of the soldiers freeze. But Laura's pulse remained steady. She moved with a speed and a savage grace that the soldiers had never seen in the clinical setting of the base hospital. This wasn't the slow, methodical, Aushunka polite care of a ward. This was violence of action applied to the art of healing. As she finished the first patient, she whistled sharply to two other soldiers who were crouching nearby, paralyzed by the noise. She signaled them to move the casualty using a proper sked litter technique she had briefly tried to teach them during a cigarette break 3 days ago, a technique they had largely ignored at the time. "Doc, we've got another one. Henderson is down, heavy bleeding from the arm," someone screamed from the far side of the courtyard. Laura didn't hesitate for a heartbeat. She used the drifting smoke for cover, staying low to the ground, moving with a tactical fluidity that suggested she had spent just as much time on the maneuver range as she had in the operating room. She reached the second casualty, a soldier who was pretending to be in deep hypovolemic shock. She felt his pulse, thready, weak, a desperate whisper of a system in total shock. "I didn't know medics ran the triage like that," a corporal muttered to himself as he watched her work from behind his barricade, his own hands shaking as he fumbled to reload a fresh magazine into his rifle. "I'm not just a medic," Laura whispered, her eyes never leaving the wound as she packed it with hemostatic gauze, her fingers digging deep into the flesh to find the source of the leak. "I'm the one who decides who gets to go home. Now, put your rifle down for 10 seconds. Hold this pressure dressing, and don't you dare let go until I tell you to." She was no longer just a support asset. She was organizing the entire courtyard. She was shouting directions to the riflemen, telling them exactly where to place the stabilized casualties so they were protected from direct fire, but easily accessible for the incoming helicopter. She was managing the priority list, the triage, deciding who was category urgent and who could wait 5 minutes. By taking the immense psychological and logistical burden of the casualties off the squad leader, she allowed him to focus his entire brain on the tactical defense of the perimeter. The squad began to realize one by one that the line wasn't just a row of smoking guns. It was a complex, interlocking network of survival. Without Laura, the courtyard would have been a chaotic graveyard of failed sensors and confused, terrified soldiers. With her, it was an organized, high-functioning trauma center under extreme pressure. The skepticism in Miller's eyes began to vanish, replaced by a dawning, humbling realization. He had called her a nurse, but he was watching a master of the battlefield. If you realize how important that medic's role is, type, "I was wrong." The instructors, watching from their elevated observation deck, decided to throw a curveball that wasn't in the mission brief. They radioed the squad leader and told him that the primary extraction point had been compromised by a simulated IED. The squad would now have to move all 4 casualties, 2 of whom were unconscious, across 50 yards of open, rocky, uneven terrain to a secondary landing zone behind a concrete wall. The squad leader looked at the distance, then at his exhausted, sweat-soaked men. "We can't move them that fast. We'll lose the perimeter. We'll be exposed in the open." Laura Bennett stood up, her face a mask of Arizona dust and dried blood from her patients, her eyes sharp, cold, and terrifyingly focused. "We use the V-drag and the buddy carry shuffle. Miller, you and Henderson take the litter. Corporal, you take the point and scan the rooftops. I'll take the rear casualty. We move in a staggered formation, 3 meters apart. I've done this in the mountains of California during search and rescue training. It works. Trust me, or we all die here." The squad leader looked at her. For the first time in the entire rotation, he didn't see a support asset or a girl. He saw a leader. He saw the person in the room with the most clarity. "Do it! Change of plan! Follow the doc's movement plan! Go! Go! Go!" The move was brutal. Dragging a 200-pound man through the soft Arizona sand is like trying to move a piano through a swamp. Every muscle fiber in their bodies was screaming, their boots slipping on the loose shale. Miller was gasping for air, his legs burning with lactic acid, his lungs feeling like they were full of hot glass. He looked back and saw Laura, her smaller frame leaning into the harness of the rear casualty, pulling with a rhythmic, unstoppable power. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't asking for help. She was simply holding her part of the line with a strength that defied her size. Suddenly, one of the casualties deteriorated mid-move. The lead instructor stepped out from behind a rock and stopped the movement for a medical check. This was the ultimate test. The needle felt like a spear in the silence of the desert. The squad formed a tight circle, their collective heartbeats the only sound in the sudden, eerie quiet. Patient is non-responsive. Breath sounds are absent on the right side. Trachea is shifting. "What do you do, Doc?" the instructor asked, crossing his arms and looking at his watch. The squad stopped in the middle of the open terrain, totally exposed. The pressure was immense. If Laura failed this clinical check, the whole 3-day drill was a mission failure for the entire unit. The soldiers watched her, their hearts pounding. This was a procedure that required more precision than any long-range shot. Laura didn't even blink. She knelt in the dirt, pulled a training needle decompression kit from the front of her vest, and began to explain the procedure with surgical, textbook precision as she worked. She described the anatomy, the second intercostal space, the mid-clavicular line, the tension pneumothorax signs she was seeing. She performed the simulated intervention, plunging the needle into the prosthetic chest with such raw confidence and speed that even the instructor, a hardened Green Beret veteran, raised an eyebrow in genuine respect. He had seen colonels freeze under less pressure. When the air hissed out, a sound representing a lung reinflating, the collective exhale of the team was louder than the simulation speakers. It wasn't just a drill anymore. It was a demonstration of a power they didn't possess. "Pressure released, breath sounds returning," Laura reported, her voice flat and professional. "Procedure successful," the instructor grunted, clearly impressed. "Continue the move. You have 60 seconds. They reached the secondary zone just as the simulated helicopter landed, marked by a thick plume of green smoke. They loaded the casualties with a speed that broke the base record for that specific exercise. As the final all clear was given by the instructors, the entire squad collapsed into the dust, their lungs burning, their uniforms soaked in a mixture of real sweat and fake blood. The silence that followed wasn't just the silence of exhaustion. It was the silence of a group of men who had just been profoundly schooled by the person they thought they had to protect. Miller walked over to Laura 10 minutes later. He was still shaking from the physical effort of the drag. He looked at her, then at the heavy medical pack she was already restacking and cleaning. He felt the weight of his own arrogance. It was heavier than any pack he had ever carried. Miller started, his voice rough and uneven. "I guess a nurse can hold the line after all, Doc. In fact, and if I'm being honest, I think you were the only one holding the whole thing together for a minute there." I was wrong." Laura looked up. She didn't look smug. She didn't offer a "told you so." She didn't give him a lecture. She just gave him a small, tired, knowing smile and handed him a bottle of lukewarm water from her side pouch. "I'm a corpsman, Miller. Our job isn't just to fix you up. Our job is to make sure the line doesn't break. Even when you're too tired or too scared to see it, drink some water, you look like hell." The twist wasn't that Laura was a hidden hero. It was that she was a specialist who had been trained for this specific kind of hell her entire adult life. She had attended the same tactical courses they had, plus another 2 years of intensive, grueling medical school. She was, by any objective definition, the most highly trained person in that courtyard. The justice came during the formal debrief. The lead instructor pointed a finger directly at Laura Bennett. "Team, you survived today because of your medic. Infantry wins battles. But logistics and medicine win missions. Miller, I think you owe her an apology. You treated her like a liability, but she was the only one who kept your mission from being a mass casualty report. If you believe quiet professionals deserve respect, type, I am in debt. The atmosphere in the barracks that evening was fundamentally different. The teasing, the nurse jokes, and the casual dismissiveness were completely gone. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead seemed to cast a different glow on the room. In their place was a quiet, profound, and hard-earned sense of brotherhood. Miller found Laura sitting on the back steps of the barracks, cleaning the fine Arizona dust out of her medical shears with an old rag. He sat down a few feet away, not saying anything for a long time, just watching the sun dip below the mountains. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was shared. "Hey, Doc," he said finally, his voice quiet. "My shoulder's been killing me since that drag. I think I pulled something. You think you could take a look at it? If you're not too busy with Band-Aids?" It was an olive branch. In the military, asking a medic for help with even a minor injury is a sign of ultimate trust. It means you recognize them as the authority. It means you are putting your well-being in their hands. Laura put down her shears. "Sit forward, Miller. Let's see what you did to yourself." As she worked on his shoulder, other soldiers began to drift over from the common room. They didn't ask for ibuprofen or Band-Aids. They asked real questions. How did you know his lung was collapsing before the instructor said anything? Can you show me that one-handed tourniquet trick again? What's the best way to carry a guy if I'm the only one left? Laura answered every single question. She spent the next 2 hours holding an impromptu class in the dirt, teaching them the skills that could one day save their lives. She wasn't the outsider anymore. She wasn't the nurse. She was the teacher. She realized then that respect in the military isn't given because of a rank on a sleeve or a gender. It's extracted through performance under pressure. "I saw it in your eyes, Doc," Miller whispered as the group finally dispersed. "When that needle went in, you weren't even breathing hard. You were just focused. I've never seen anyone hold the line like that. I'm sorry I was an idiot." "We're all idiots until we're tested, Miller," she replied softly. "Just don't forget that the line is only as strong as the person next to you." The squad leader watched the scene from the doorway, a satisfied look on his face. He had seen many medics come and go through his unit, but he had never seen one capture the hearts and the respect of the men so completely in a single day. He went back to his desk and made a final note in his after-action report. "Petty Officer Bennett is a force multiplier. Her presence increases the combat effectiveness and the morale of the entire squad. Recommend permanent attachment. If you believe respect should come from actions, type Tuai Sisong 2TE. Laura Bennett is back on her regular rotation now. She still carries that 60-pound bag. She still wakes up at 4 a.m. for morning PT, and she still stands at the very back of the line during the morning muster. But things are different now. When the squad goes out on a new drill, and they see Laura Bennett stepping into the Humvee, they don't joke about nurses anymore. They don't tell her to stay in the rear or watch out for the dust. Instead, they make sure she has the best seat in the vehicle. They check her gear to make sure she's comfortable. And when they hit the range, they don't look to the squad leader first. They look to Laura for the signal. They've learned that a rifle can clear a room, but only Doc can clear the fear of not making it home. This story isn't just about a woman proving she can do a man's job. It's about the concept of the quiet professional. It's about the millions of people who work in the shadows, the ones who don't need the glory, who don't need the medals, but who hold the world together with their bare hands when it starts to fall apart at the seams. In every office, in every hospital, in every street, there are Doc Bennetts. There are people you might be underestimating right now because they don't fit your preconceived image of a leader. They are the ones who listen while others talk. They are the ones who prepare while others sleep. They are the ones who study the tiny ticks so they can prevent the big explosions. And when the real crisis comes, when the smoke fills the courtyard of your life, they are the ones who will step forward and hold the line for you, even when you don't deserve it. They are the guardians of the transition between life and death. the silent anchors in a world of chaos. We often look at the person with the gun and call them the warrior. But sometimes, the real warrior is the one with the stethoscope and the tourniquet. The one who has the immense courage to heal in the middle of a war. They carry the heaviest weight because they carry the lives of everyone else. Laura is still out there, somewhere in the desert, or maybe on a ship in the middle of a dark ocean. You might not see her name in the headlines. You might not see her face on a recruitment poster. But if you are ever in trouble, if you are ever lying in the dirt and the world is turning black and you can't breathe, you'll pray for a Laura Bennett to find you. Because she doesn't care about the jokes. She doesn't care about the ego. She only cares about Maju Duinat, holding the line so you can go home to your family. She is the shadow that guards the light, the healer who became the shield. If you believe quiet professionals deserve recognition, leave a comment and subscribe The Veteran's Story. These are the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.